Hey, good morning, everybody. It's Dave from Corepoint. I appreciate everybody being on time this morning, and I'd love to get started with our webinar. We're going to be sort of in lecture mode for 30 to 50 minutes talking about APIs and FHIR, and then I'd love to take questions. So I've got a technical resource that's monitoring the question and session, the chat session. Feel free to dig in over there and ask questions as we go along. We'll try to organize and curate those questions, and at the end we will dive in and answer as many of those as possible. And I'm happy to hang around as long as we've got questions and time available. As a warm-up, I think it's super appropriate to talk about how we ended up being in the situation of yet another standard. So XKCD has this classic comment, a comic of we start with 14 competing standards, and of course we look at this and say, my goodness, there are way too many standards. We need one universal standard that covers all these cases. And of course, coming soon is that there's now one additional standard, making 15 total. That's really kind of where we are in a large circular kind of way. That HL7 certainly has been working on standards since 1987. And we continue to improve and make those standards better, and they're not going anywhere, specifically HL7 V2 and CDA. But we also are growing and changing in terms of technology and as an industry. So I kind of want to set the stage as we start and say that in the years that I've participated in the HL7 world and as an interface engine guy, I really wear two hats, right? On the left-hand side, we've got the concept of HL7 volunteer and community member. I sit on the board of HL7. I sit on the board of the FHIR Foundation. I co-chair various committees. So I think this is really important that as a community we come together and we talk about this in a vendor-neutral way. I think the other hat that is worn by virtually everybody that's an HL7 volunteer is either as a provider or a vendor. And I happen to wear the hat of having spent the last 20 years at Corepoint, where we have built an awesome integration engine that allows data to exchange and supports a wide variety of standards, including FHIR and APIs. So I'm going to try to spend most of my time, if not all of my time today, on the left-hand side of this screen as a volunteer and as a vendor-neutral guy. If we end up talking about product, it's mostly just as an example rather than trying to sell you our particular interface engine. I'd like to get started early with a poll, because I think we have a wide mix of people that are on the phone today. It'd be awesome if you guys could give me some feedback on why you're joining us today, right? Just to learn a little bit about FHIR, to learn about APIs, to figure out ultimately what brings you guys here. We'll leave this open just for a couple minutes or a couple seconds, and away we go. Awesome. So our results, hopefully you can see these. We've got, obviously, given the title of this, right, that 90% of the people are here to learn about APIs, and we've got about a fourth of you that are current customers. So that's super helpful to see that our current customers are taking advantage of an educational session to kind of see how they might extend their HL7 V2 or CDA approaches to take advantage of FHIR. So I appreciate you guys digging into that poll. If I can spend the first 5 to 7 minutes talking about HL7, historically I've always said that what HL7 provides is it makes it easier for us to integrate. You always have to look at the tense of this and say, well, it doesn't make it easy to integrate. It's easier when compared to other methods. So HL7 V2 and now FHIR are making it easier to integrate, but ultimately this is still not easy, because HL7 is really a framework for negotiation. And as Wes Rischel, one of the founders of HL7, likes to say, when you've seen one HL7 interface, you've seen one. Keith Boone added that says, you know, communication and interoperability aren't really a science. They're much more of an art form perfected over time. So there's a whole bunch of opportunity and challenge available to us in the marketplace. And I always like to think of this in terms of a triple constraint, as it's called. And there's all kinds of these triple constraints that we use in the technology world, you know, whether it's fast, cheap, or good, or whether it's privacy, accuracy, and security. One of my favorite is fast, small, flexible. And the whole idea is that, well, if you are interested in a triple constraint, often you have to make trade-offs between these. That if you want it both fast and small, it's probably not flexible. And if you want it flexible and small, it's probably not fast. So it's that kind of trade-off back and forth. And I think that in general, people in healthcare want IT applications, EMRs, and point solutions, departmental applications, to be cheap, flexible, and interoperable. So what that means in general, if I was to describe each one of these terms, is that it be usable by a specific department or be usable across many facilities or many departments or customers. It'd be flexible, supporting lots of workflows that should work as well in an ambulatory care environment as it does an inpatient. It should be configurable. That means that, you know, if I'm a children's hospital and I'm focused on providing pediatric care, I should be able to configure the application to meet my requirements. And interoperable means that it works across these care settings, workflows, and departments, and it should do so for free because this is a necessary evil. And I do believe that these constraints apply in healthcare IT pretty directly, meaning that if you want something that's very configurable and very flexible, supporting lots of different facilities, you start to lose the interoperability. Or conversely, if you say, I want it to be truly interoperable plug and play, you begin to either leave out things that impact usability, whether that's UX, environment, or flexibility, meaning, you know, order sets are more constrained and that kind of thing. So everybody that is technical knows how we move data back and forth, but I think that I want to make this point and kind of draw in where I believe APIs and FHIR fit. So when we talk about HL7 version 2, on the left I've got what I historically have called a hospital information system. These days we call it an electronic health record or an electronic medical record. So the EHR is talking to the laboratory information system on the right-hand side. And historically, these were independent databases, independent vendors. So I might have Epic on the left, and I might have Cerner Lab on the right, or Cerner EMR on the left, and SunQuest Lab on the right. Pick your favorite vendors. It could be left and right. Each of these databases is designed by that vendor. Each of the user experiences is designed by that vendor. And ultimately, when we want to move data from one to another, a physician or caregiver is typing data into the EMR, and there is an export module, what I call lovingly the blue box, that is written by the vendor and allows the data to leave the EMR in an HL7 version 2 format. It could also be an export of a CDA document, but I think we should focus on the workflow internally. So things like I admit a patient, and when I finish the admission, there is an HL7 message that is sent to a trading partner, the lab system. Or when I enter a lab order, I send my lab order over this interface. And likewise, there is a box, a piece of code on the receiving side. The lab vendor writes an import module, lovingly the yellow box, which is going to be accepting the data, walking through that information, and then aligning it with the database. So the gateway to and from the database on either end is a piece of code that is owned by the respective vendor. The blue box is owned by the EMR vendor. The yellow box is owned by the lab vendor. And of course, this works the opposite direction, that once the data is in the hands of the laboratory person and they do a result or do an order confirmation, data flows the other direction. So this is really basic, but the key point is these databases aren't HL7 version 2 native, and they vary in the way in which they treat this information. This is part of the flexibility. This is part of the works for a specific department in the triple constraint. And the way we add some interoperability for that third leg of the triple constraint is through these modules that send and receive data. So HL7 v2 grew up with this idea that, hey, we just hook all these dudes together. We have point-to-point interfaces that we're allowing these guys to talk to one another. This means that the EMR vendor on the left, right, the big green box could be my inpatient. The orange box could be my outpatient. I've got NextGen on the top and Meditech on the bottom. We end up with lots of yellow and blue boxes and a need to maintain these. Most folks have an engine today, whether it's Cloverleaf or Mirth or, of course, Corepoint integration engine, sitting in the middle that allows a central monitoring, alerting, flow control, and mapping environment to get the data to move between these applications in a constrained and orchestrated fashion. That's really what an integration engine provides in the context of HL7 V2, or again CDA if I'm moving documents back and forth. So the dream, of course, is that, hey, you know, if I've got my internal integration solved, I could just send all this information to a health information exchange, be it regional or be it state-oriented, and then those guys would feed the data off to my trading partners at St. Luke's, et cetera. What often happens is that I end up building an additional interface, potentially, to my trading partner to provide data that is not part of the HIE platform, right? Or even worse, I end up having guys that I need to send data to that aren't even on the HIE. So there's an interesting opportunity as an integration team that says, you know, inside my St. Francis box, I need to focus on my own integration, and I'm becoming, you know, as it become more connected in healthcare environment, we're sending a lot more data externally, and maybe one day the HIEs will do what I want, or my vendor provides. If I'm an Epic customer using Epic Connect, I have the ability to send the data to a trading partner through an HIE-like thing at Epic. So we want to keep that idea that some integration is internal and some is external. And I want to kind of warm up by saying, well, what can an API do and how is it that it works? So back to my yellow box, blue box picture, I again have the EMR on the left and I have the lab system on the right. And let's imagine that I'm a phlebotomist. So as a phlebotomist, my job is to go stick patients, draw blood, sample, bring those samples labeled appropriately back to the lab and check them into the lab for samples for our lab tests. So we've talked about the HL7 V2 data going back and forth across those yellow and blue boxes. As a phlebotomist, I might log into a web portal or a FIC client on my SunQuest lab or my Cerner lab, and I'm asking the lab system to either print me a report or to provide me data on simple things like where is the patient, right? I need a list of draws that I'm going to go do on the floor 4, and what samples am I supposed to draw? You know, how many red tops versus blue tops am I supposed to get? You know, has this order been canceled? Do I still need the draw? You know, I want to update the fact that I've pulled this sample and I'm going to check this and barcode this in. So we can imagine that historically, on the right-hand side, right, the workflow is accomplished through a user experience or user interface designed by the SunQuest application in my example. And we can then further imagine that that single source of truth in that database is still awesome, but I want to use a tablet or a phone to accomplish the same thing. So I have a mobile, whether it's a computer on wheels or whether it's something else, I'd like to use a tablet in order to interact with my lab system. So this is an API. That API might be proprietary, where the lab vendor says, you know, we use this internally for our application development and you're not allowed to use this. Almost all applications, whether they're published or not, have some API like this. If you happen to have a vendor and that vendor publishes that API, you clearly could write your own blood collection or your own application that could interact with your lab system. But normally what happens is that these APIs are hidden, and we still have a single source of truth in terms of the laboratory workflow. The lab is the place where the phlebotomist needs to figure out where the patients are, you know, what sequence I'm supposed to be drawing the samples in, and which samples I'm drawing. So we could imagine that that we could leverage in a standard, we could leverage a standard like HL7 FHIR but maybe in a proprietary way, meaning that the lab vendor says, I'm going to add a FHIR API to my application, and I'm going to use this FHIR API in order to build my mobile application for rounding. And the phlebotomist then continues to do his or her work exactly as we did with the proprietary API. It so happens that this API is now implemented in FHIR. I think this is one of the first things we're going to see happen in terms of the adoption of FHIR, and I'll talk more about how FHIR fits and what it does here in a moment. But think about this as a vendor says, well, I'd like to start by using FHIR internally, and then over time, we can imagine that we'll have multiple interfaces and multiple applications that support FHIR, and as a physician, I still will admit and order data through HL7 V2, but that data, once available in each database, I could now imagine that the application has the ability to, for example, through FHIR, query the lab and say, hey, tell me about the patients that need to have samples drawn, and rather than depending on the lab system to tell me where those patients are, let me go talk to the source of truth and ask if those patients are still in the locations that the lab thinks they're in. So this is a classic example of, we know the source of truth is on the left for the order status, whether or not the physician still wants this order. We know the source of truth on the left is also holding the bed census. So those two things would be awesome to be able to access through FHIR. And I think that's, again, one of the things we're going to see happen over time is these point applications are going to be able to talk to multiple different applications to gain data from the source of truth. And we can imagine it continuing, right, that I would collect these samples, I would check them in, I would mark these orders as pending, and then ultimately HL7 V2 is still going to be used to push the data on the back end. And as we warm up into this, we can think that eventually there'll be lots of different applications speaking FHIR within the four walls and exchanging this data. And again, the difference is that we're using a different module, my little red boxes here, to map from each of the databases into the FHIR standard rather than from each of the databases into the HL7 V2 standard. We're going to have some of the same opportunities in terms of data flow within the four walls. We can imagine that an engine will still sit in the middle of the HL7 V2 environment, and at the same time, we may have applications that speak FHIR, and that FHIR data can come into an integration engine, which can in turn potentially do something like map. So we might have a bedside cart where an EKG is created that is published through the FHIR standard, and the engine accepts that publication, translates that into a PDF or translates it into a CDA, and then delivers it to the EHR through traditional means. Likewise, we can imagine that the lab may have one flavor of FHIR and the EMR may have another flavor of FHIR. So we need to do API management in the middle, where we're taking different profiles or different approaches to FHIR and doing a map back and forth. So I think there's a whole other category of things that we could talk about, and specifically this is smart on FHIR. I'd love to do another hour seminar on just how smart is going to impact and potentially interact with your world. One of the shortest examples you can give is that this can be specialized charting. So the idea being that I'm sitting inside Cerner, I'm sitting inside Epic, I have this patient data in front of me. I sure wish I had a specialized chart that I could pull up to provide patient care and some assistance in this process of treating the patient. And I may not be able to have that chart courtesy of Epic or Cerner, but I can get it from a vendor on the internet, right? So there's some ability to be able to take data right out of my EMR, feed it off to a charting application in the sky, and then have that data displayed to me effectively within the EMR. And the same thing is true for something like a cardiac test where I want to give something to the patient that shows them their cardiac risk in a beautiful way. I may not be able to print that out directly from Meditech, but the data is sitting in Meditech, which are these lab results. This data can be fed to a web application that can produce me a PDF that I can drop and hand to the patient as part of my consultation with that patient. So there's a whole other part of this which is beyond just sort of simply exchanging data back and forth. We would like to use that data exchange in the context of extending my application. So that's another hour seminar, and I got a link at the end if you're interested in more of this detail on SMART. The last thing I wanted to do as a warm-up was to say that there's this long history of HL7 v2. When we talk about HL7, we think mostly about HL7 v2. This has been ongoing since 1987. We can think about HL7 v3, which ultimately became the basis of CDA, and we can think about FHIR now, and the fact that we've only been working on this since 2012. We've gone through 3 drafts of FHIR, and we're working on what's called R4, which should be available next year. And parts of R4 are going to be normative. So rather than the approach we took historically, which was, hey, here's HL7 version 2.3 and here's 2.3.1, and the entire thing was considered normative when it was published, same is true with CDA. The approach we're taking with FHIR is that we need a certain amount of implementation that proves that the standard works, and when those certain parts of the standard have reached maturity, we will consider them done and available and not likely to be changing substantially, and thus going normative. That's really kind of a different approach that FHIR is taking. So let's do another poll. Let's answer these questions about how APIs are impacting you. So from the no significant use to we're using some proprietary APIs, or gosh, we're deeply involved in APIs today. Super helpful. About half y'all have voted. So we've got about half of you that are using significantly are using no APIs. Interestingly, there's about 20% that are already having APIs play a core role, which I would love to, as part of the chat, maybe at the end we can talk about ways in which you guys are currently using APIs, since FHIR is still pretty new. So I appreciate that feedback. That's very helpful. I think that a next portion of this is around how APIs are impacting you today. And I got my third poll here, which is, do you think HIT vendors will open up their APIs? And of course, I got multiple flavors of yes and no, because it's not fair just to say yes and no. If you say yes, I'd love to know if you think it's in their business interest, or only if they're forced to do so, forced in a positive way, or they want to keep their data to themselves for one reason or another. I think about half y'all are voted in, which is helpful. Okay, so we've got most of us thinking that yes, we will have data shared through APIs. The majority of us believe that they'll only do so when asked to strongly. Forced is a loaded word, but customers saying, gosh, I really got to have my API data, or things like our federal government suggesting very strongly through regulation in stage 3 of meaningful use that we have APIs that are open. So that, again, that's very helpful. I appreciate that. I want to talk a little bit about the motivation for APIs and kind of where we fit. In short, what APIs allow me to do, as I was showing with my red boxes, is access data at the source of truth when needed in real time. This is different than the way in which HL7 V2 works, which is when the yellow box and the blue box get to a point in the workflow where we need to exchange a transaction, an HL7 V2 message goes across. It also allows us to modernize our infrastructure. If we think about transactions, be those CDI, X12, or HL7, we can move up to more modern encoding techniques, and probably more interestingly to discrete data. Most people focus on this technology piece, which I don't think is nearly as interesting as being able to think about the ways in which accessing data at the source of truth will really impact care coordination. So there's a wide variety of people that would really love to get their hands on data that's trapped inside Meditech or SunQuest or whoever the application vendor is. And those include folks like the patient, external providers. Obviously the payers would love to get their hands on more clinical data, big pharma, research organizations, the government, whoever is standing around the outside saying, if we had access to discrete data at the source of truth, what would we do with it? And there's a bunch of people that today depend on claims data, which clearly is out of date by the time they get it, and also very watered down in terms of the depth of detail that's given in a set of claims data. I think that broader availability of these standards means that there's a lot more data that's available. So I like to use examples like in-home monitoring, whether it's home health, whether it's a smart scale or a spirometer, whatever it might be that we're using to help to manage asthma, for example, or congestive heart failure in terms of weight loss or gain. It could be self-assessments, as simple as asking the patient if they've eaten their breakfast or if they've taken their medication, and being able to answer these questions on a device or on a smart application. There's all kinds of things that are really quite cool in terms of the Internet of Things and the sensors we can put on. I don't think, a lot of people jump immediately to things like, the quantified self and the Fitbit, and most of the clinicians you talk to are excited that people want to measure their exercise, but broadly are not terribly interested in looking at that exercise data unless it's in the context of a patient. So my daughter, for example, recently had ACL surgery. So I don't know, for PT would really be interested in looking at all of her exercise data all the time, but certainly would love to probably make sure that, over the course of the 3 days between PT appointments, some mechanism to measure extension of her knee would be very helpful, right? So being able to take that data in a non-Fitbitty way, but in a home monitoring kind of way, and sharing that amongst caregivers, I think is pretty cool. I think the most interesting thing that happens with an API is that these are capability-based rather than workflow-based. So what I mean by capability-based, back to my example of the red box on the side of the SunQuest application in the lab, if I've got an API that allows me to work with samples or to ask questions of the lab system, it means that if it's published and available, back to our 54% that said we're going to have access to data through APIs if the vendors allow us to or are forced to give it to us, we can think that capability allows me to do things like query the status of samples or query the status of orders, or in the context of the application that's providing the bed census, I can use it in the lab to help figure out where the phlebotomist should go. But once I have a query on the side of Epic that lets me look at the bed census, I can also use it for housekeeping to make sure that beds are clean, or that we notice a bed goes empty, we want to mark it as being in progress for being cleaned. So those are internal motivations in workflow base. We can also imagine that, again, this external integration pays dividends when it's secure and when it's authorized. where we can do all kinds of things. This is the list of people on the right-hand side that have an interest in the data that's sitting inside the source of truth. So I think that's pretty critical that we think about, again, internal sharing of data, kind of the classic HL7 V2, but with real-time access at the source of truth. We also think about internal sharing with that smart on FHIR thing I briefly mentioned, right? That internal sharing meaning that I have an application in the cloud, I'd like to give it access as a caregiver to some portion of the patient record and allow me to do something clever with it. So lots of interesting opportunities, internal and external, regardless of what the standard is once we've got an open API. So if we look at the difference between APIs and traditional V2 interfaces, we can think about this as that interaction between the user and the database. It may take dozens of trips back and forth between the database and the user GUI to actually create a transaction. So to do an admission, for example, I may have screens in my HIS that allow me to do things like a master patient index lookup, look for an empty bed of a particular type. For bed census module, I go to the provider directory to look up the physician and the location of care. I go to the payer to find the right insurance company, the guarantor. I go to terminology to pick the right gender, the right religion, the right ambulatory status. So there's all these things that I do in my application that mean that each time I'm pulling up a new screen, I'm going to a source of truth within my database. And we can imagine that some of this could be done through an API. So if I've got an external MPI, for example, I can, in my workflow through FHIR or through a proprietary API like we might have on the side of an MPI, I can do a query that says, tell me about patient X, and or find me patient that has these attributes, which means that I'm now pushing data historically with transactions from the source of truth versus pulling data when needed. So we can imagine that, you know, the ADT feed is constantly telling me this patient's been updated, this patient's been admitted, this patient's been moved, this patient's been discharged. The other choice is that we say, look, there's an API that allows you to ask any of those questions anytime you want. Just come to the source of truth and ask that question. And you don't have to store any of that data that you're not interested in. So that means that we are able to ask for data in a polling environment, and I think just as interesting, often an API is used to get to application-specific data, meaning data that is not necessarily standardized and available. So let's talk about FHIR specifically. I have another poll question here of how do we think FHIR is going to impact your job or business, everything from small change to big change. I'd love your thoughts on this. We got about half y'all who voted. Keep them coming. Okay. We can see that most of us believe that there's going to be some small or large impact on your daily life. And given that most of us are either vendors or are technical IT guys at providers, that's, I think, a fair statement. That would be fun to have the debate, as I like to say, a beer drinking conversation about how soon this would happen. But I think this is fair, that I'm surprised and happy to see that people are accepting that there's lots of impact that's coming. So let's talk about the difference between technology and interoperability, right? That I think these vendor-specific APIs allow us to look inside a walled garden, as it's called, where that data is still proprietary to the vendor. If I have, you know, a proprietary API on Epic or on a EMR like Greenway or NextGen, I can look inside and interact with that API with the data, but it's not specific. It's not broad enough that allows me to have an industry-wide interoperability solution. So I think that what I like to talk about FHIR and talk about HL7 broadly is that while I'm equally excited about the fact that we're using modern technology, you know, and the lineup is using REST with payloads of either XML or JSON, I don't think we want to let that overshadow the fact that, you know, providing standard profiles and providing a standard communications infrastructure is probably more interesting in the round than the fact that it's REST. I think that if we can eliminate the technical hurdles and providing this detail, it's a huge win. I think the magic of FHIR and any API really is accessing data at the source of truth, right? This allows brand new mechanisms for us to interact with that with the data that we've never had access to before. Okay, so next poll question is, how do we see FHIR being used in your organization? Again, I've drawn that distinction between internal and external integration, and it would be exciting to see what people think are going to happen. About half you all that have voted. Keep them coming. Okay, very helpful. So I am surprised that people came out as strongly as they did around the equal mix of internal and external, or even more surprised by the fact that if we add these together, right, we've got 80% of the people that believe external integration is going to play a super important part of why FHIR is going to come into their facility. Very, very helpful. I appreciate that. So what I want to talk about is kind of that internal versus external integration, right? So we think that that we're going to end up with a mix of these tilted towards external. So I think if I think about these attributes of what is that red box going to do on the side of the HIS, the EMR, these applications in general, I think today we look at Epic or Cerner, and again, not just to pick on those guys, but Epic, Cerner, or any of the other vendors that are providing EMR software. We think about those as being the source of truth, right? I rally around all my ancillary applications against that EMR. I think that HIS database is going to become much more transparent, that I'll be able to import and export data more easily from that database, besides just going through the GUI to do that. I think that the market dynamics are really unclear, but I predict that this is going to be pretty earth-shattering or earth-shaking anyway, in terms of what happens to those that own the data today. So if I'm a Cerner-centric shop and I've put all my data into the Cerner EMR, what does that mean for me going forward 10 years from now? How much data is available to me besides just through the yellow and blue box from HL7 and the GUI that is present on Cerner? What is the FHIR red box going to do for me? And I think there's an analogy to be drawn, you know, in the PACS world, in the imaging space. There was a huge, you know, long market build of functionality around PACS, whether it was, you know, computer-aided diagnostics, or whether it was workflow for viewing stations, you know, markup for images. There was a very expensive combination of storage of images and workflow around radiology and management and reporting of those images. And that was all sort of smushed together into a thing we called PACS. And I think that's kind of where we are with the EMR today, that we think about patient management and in order management and vocabulary and terminology and everything else. The main HIS has lots of functionality all bundled together. What happened in the PACS market was that the vendor-neutral archive vendors showed up, and that the vendor-neutral archive guys pulled the image storage out from underneath the PACS guys. So that had a pretty significant impact positive and negative depending on what side of the equation you're on the radiology side and the imaging side. But I think the same thing has a potential of happening on the internal integration side for healthcare in provision of non-imaging data. So I think there's this pendulum that in my 20-odd years in the healthcare world, we have been swinging back and forth between best of breed, lots of applications integrated together, versus big monolithic application that we would say holds everything, right? We got a module and not all the modules are the best of the best, but gosh, the fact that they're all running on one database means that they're synergistically more powerful than independent modules running on independent databases. I think FHIR can cause some disruption to the cycle. I think it also means that point or departmental solutions could return in vogue. If nothing else, it means that super point solutions, like I need to produce a report for my patient about their cardiac risk using these 15 factors that come out of my EMR. I don't like the way Meditech produces that report, or it can't produce that report. I'm going to use a Smart on FHIR application to pull the data from my EMR, prepare me a PDF, and to be able to print it for my patient. From an external integration standpoint, I think that Smart on FHIR, as I'm just talking about, will allow these web applications to assist with things like disease management, insurance workflows, pre-authorizations that are difficult to accomplish today. I think FHIR is ultimately going to be used beyond just these API kind of ways. I think FHIR will ultimately progress. There's a whole part of FHIR, kind of like my little hand wave of Smart on FHIR. There's a hand wave around FHIR messages. That there's a section that allows me to encode, much like HL7 v2, messages or packages of resources and send them like I do an HL7 ADT message. And in addition, we're working on ways in which we can take the data that would appear in a CDA document and put it into a FHIR document. So I think FHIR in the next 15 years is kind of that one format for all of healthcare interoperability. And I think, as I said, that when FHIR APIs are opened up, there's a lot of amazing things that happen in terms of the transformation of healthcare. That we think today, meaningful use required that we have a patient portal, and that the provider somehow stands up that patient portal, and I log into the St. Francis portal to get my data. We can imagine that through my Apple eco environment, my infrastructure that's available to me through my Apple application or my Google application or my PHR that I'm maintaining on the web. I give my credentials to the St. Francis FHIR hookup, and I'm able to pull the data directly and discreetly out of the EMR that is at St. Francis and put it into the cloud. And I think that data aggregation can be used in a bunch of really unexpected ways, both positive and negative, as we push forward. So how do we look at how HIEs, engines, and API managers are going to work together? Clearly, we could spend another hour talking about all the moving pieces, but I do think that we think about the internal applications being connected together, be that through web services or through HL7 v2, whether it be through FHIR, all the things we talked about with multiple red boxes and yellow and blue boxes internally. And I think there's a gateway that sits between the internal and the external world, and whether that's something like a Corepoint integration engine or whether it's a API management platform, there's this requirement to pull the data from those external locations and bring it internal. And as we just talked about, 37% of us think there's an equal mix, and 24% say we're mostly external. So this right-hand side of this picture is super critical for that thought around the data movement, right? We're going to have a lot of data that is going to be going externally. So my last technical poll, how do we plan to manage FHIR APIs in the future? So we can range from I'm just going to let my vendor figure it out to I'm going to use my integration engine or existing stack. I'm likely to buy a new solution for my API management. There's things like Apigee or Akana, which are a API manager platform that are very generic horizontal platform. Or I might even buy a FHIR management platform. About half of us have voted, very helpful. So as you can see, everybody hopes that their existing integration engine vendor or technology stack is going to solve the problem, or combined with 26% of y'all are hoping that the clinical application vendor will solve this. So I draw the parallel that 75% of us are looking at the existing vendors to resolve this issue, with almost a third of us saying that we're going to let the vendor that is responsible for the data deal with the FHIR piece of this, which is surprising to me. And I think equally surprising, a third of us aren't sure how we're going to solve this problem. It may be that we're not sure of the impact, or we're not sure, how that's going to play out. I think these last two polls go together really well, right? That if we believe as a group that external integration is going to play a large role, or at least as much of a role as the internal integration, depending on those existing vendors to solve this is important, right? Begin those conversations with your vendors and ask them what their plans are. So again, very helpful to me as we dive into this. I think the last poll I'll stick up before we leave is more internal in terms of follow-up. We'd love to talk with you some more. So before I do my Q&A, which I'm down to about 10 minutes to do my Q&A, I'd love to hear your next steps. If you'd like us to follow up in terms of webinars, I think some of our questions are going to be about Corepoint specific functionality, so we'd love to follow up with another webinar in that regard. We also do a lot of HL7 and FHIR training. That's been a big part of our community outreach over time. So you can select as many of these as you like, and we'd love to have some follow-up with you on these. So as I roll into my Q&A, I'm also going to put up on the board a set of resources that we can have you guys use to follow up for more information. And I'm going to ask Jeff, I believe is on the call with me, to feed me the questions that have been asked. So please type your questions into the question window, into the chat window, and Jeff will give it a whirl.
Yes, Dave. So I'll start with this one. The question is, how will FHIR ensure better consistency? For example, what prevents one user from using a different field than another user for the same data?
Great question. So how do we get more consistent in our approach to interoperability? I think as we learned in the days of HL7 v2, we can extend HL7 v2 through the use of Z segments or Z segments if you're European, and that allows us to send virtually any data that we want. And what we learned in that process is that if those are not, if there's no standard way to profile a Z segment, they truly become proprietary. And I think that's an important parallel to draw to what we do with proprietary APIs, that a proprietary API that almost always is one-for-one with the database, those don't allow interoperability, but they do allow me to talk to the data at its source of truth. I think Z segments have that same challenge in V2. In FHIR, what we allow is we have the 80% rule, which means that if we believe that 80% of the vendors would likely support this, or 80% of the providers will likely need this, we argue for a long time and try to standardize that particular portion of the data model and the interoperability. If it's not in the 80%, we push it off to an extension. So what's different in parallel, both at the same time with between FHIR and V2, is that V2 allows you to extend through Z segments. FHIR allows you to extend through extensions, but we have a formal framework that allows those extensions to be profiled and shared. So if there's a particular state requirement or there's a particular cancer reporting infrastructure issue, rather than having to create Z segments for every site or every vendor, we can build a standard profile and publish it, part of what the FHIR Foundation is working on, publish these profiles so that everybody can see what those extensions look like. So that's a great question. I appreciate that.
Thanks, Dave. The questions are starting to fire in now, so that was an unintended pun. Here's another one. We've been using another interface engine forever. Building interfaces involves lots of code, and my current engine does not support FHIR. Should I wait for support or add a new platform just for FHIR?
Another awesome question. I think that, as we saw in the poll that we just did, most people are either unsure that how they're gonna solve the FHIR problem, or they're looking at their current vendors to solve this. So I think the first comment I would have is, again, I'm wearing my left hat here, and that I'm a community member talking generically about the solution. Clearly, I have a right-hand hat also, which is as a vendor in this space. I think that you know, I would suggest that broadly, there's a lot of reasons to upgrade your platform if you're still writing code. There are different or better opportunities to more simply and more succinctly build interfaces using a different product like the Corepoint product. So you might look at an uplift in your technology over time. I don't think it has to be a knife switch where if you're using a product that may or may not support FHIR, or it takes a long time to build interfaces, you can look to add or augment your engine by picking up a Corepoint product or some other product that you think is going to be more efficient in building interfaces. I would look very carefully at the vendors that you are currently using or depending on. And in this context, it was an engine vendor. So look at that engine vendor and see what level of participation they have in the FHIR organization. Are they helping build the standard? Do they hold committee membership, or are they committing to the FHIR standard in some fashion? Beyond simply saying, yeah, we checkbox this, you know, we supposedly support FHIR. That means a lot of things to a lot of people. That, you know, our again, in my right-hand hat, our engine is one of the first to formally support FHIR and actually have profiles that support the different versions of FHIR. So I would love to, in a follow-up conversation, talk more about why I think our engine is a good fit for maybe both of those problems: building interfaces faster, reducing code, and supporting FHIR.
Thanks, Dave. Here is another question. Do you see FHIR as ultimately supplementing IHE profiles, such as XDS, XCA, etc., or supplanting them?
Another good question. I think the answer is augmenting. The IHE guys are actively building and looking, well, either actively profiling against the FHIR standard, or looking for it to assist in this process. At least in the U.S., we have the opportunity that, you know, in meaningful use, we already have a mechanism for exchanging documents and doing, you know, community care coordination through XDSB and friends. I'm not a big believer in just tearing stuff down because, you know, we have something new and shiny. Much like I don't believe HL7 V2 is going to be, you know, reduced in its requirement. We're still going to send a lot of lab results through V2 and a lot of ADT through V2 and a lot of, you know, care coordination documents through CDA and virtually all the charges in the U.S. anyway through X12. I see FHIR being these new opportunities. So, you know, a good example in the IHE world would be, we've got the PICS PDQ environment where I can do a query for a patient, and that's an interaction that is not terribly well supported in HL7 V2 or V3. There's a profile for this query in IHE. It makes a lot more sense, in my opinion, to use something like FHIR. So we'll see whether that, think about, again, not replacing things that already work, but say, where is it that we don't have good interactions today, courtesy of IHE or any other standard, and how is it I could change my world if I had access to the data in real time at the source of truth. So I'm a big greenfield guy. I think there's so many problems that we have left to solve in healthcare. Distribution of lab results is one that's fixed. I don't think we need to work on that at this moment. So great question.
Here's another. Even though there is PACS in radiology, can you see a use of FHIR in this specialty?
I believe the answer is yes. That if we think about radiology, there's all kinds of interactions that don't work very well today. I'm not a DICOM specialist, but there's this performed procedure step, for example, that is part of DICOM but doesn't seem to be widely implemented. That's a place that I think could be augmented with FHIR. I think even better, there's data, discrete data, for example, that might be in a DICOM SR or trapped in an ultrasound somewhere. We could imagine that, I could have a second API on a PACS that not only would give me a DICOM image, but might give me metadata about the image, or give me, the SR data only about an image. So specifically in terms of the PACS, I can see useful things popping out of it. I think more broadly, there's a lot of really cool things that can happen with workflows, like modification of orders or notification of orders. Radiology has a huge advantage and disadvantage in that most radiology practices are reading from many institutions at the same time. So the holy grail is unified work list, right? I want a single place I can go and see the list of things that need to be read. Or if I'm a spine specialist, I want to read just the spines across multiple institutions on one PACS. And a lot of that integration is really, really difficult because getting access to the source of data at that source of truth is impossible. There are no APIs. So I think that I'd look broader beyond PACS and say that radiology workflow has the potential of many in healthcare to be deeply impacted in a very positive way with being able to go talk to these various systems at the source of truth rather than depending on the push model. So that's I know our particular engine is deployed in a large number of radiology clients to help with those workflow problems. So think broad beyond PACS, and I'm all in.
Here's another, Dave. What large vendors are currently accepting FHIR requests, and what solutions are they trying to solve? For example, Cerner seems to have a large presence in Smart on FHIR, but how is it being used?
I think the answer is we're all very early. There's a large, I could put the slide up, or you can just go Google the Project Argonaut stuff. I was just sitting here looking to see if I had that on my resources, and I don't. So the Project Argonaut, you can find there's about 50 major vendors that are participating in that process, and Cerner is certainly one of the leaders in that space. I think the first baby step that the Project Argonaut guys are trying to take, which is appropriate, is read-only access to data that all of the EMR vendors were forced to have courtesy of meaningful use. So rather than saying we're going to, spray out all kinds of data, we're just going to start with these elements that we already know have to go into a CD or are part of meaningful use. Let's just get access to the data that we know is already there. So that's really the parts, the workflows that are in progress today. I think that those first baby steps are okay. I think what's much more interesting is as we build out more vendors that have access to more of their database, courtesy of that red box and courtesy of the FHIR resources becoming more standard, that we'll find that more workflows are more positively impacted. So I think, it's fair to say, regardless of what vendors tell you, it's fair to say that we're really early in this, and the production deployments of FHIR that I have heard about or seen are really limited in terms of their scope of use today. And they're much more like, that's the reason I started with my example, they're much more internal focused. It's one thing, it's okay if a lab vendor sticks on the side of their application a FHIR API and then writes their proprietary application to talk that FHIR API. I consider that a successful FHIR deployment and a production use of FHIR, but it's not as exciting to me as multiple FHIR endpoints that we can query through the engine or query through a workflow scenario of some sort. So we're early. Look up Project Argonaut. And also go to that smarthealthit.org to see the Smart on FHIR apps. I think would be two places I would look for production use.
I would like to interject. We've had a few questions about making the recording and the presentation available. And after tomorrow's session, we'll send a link out to everybody that they can view that. Secondarily, it is 2 minutes after 11, so if you have questions that aren't going to be able to be answered, we will rather reply to you via email form after the fact offline. And Dave, if you're good to stick around for a couple of minutes, we can answer a few of these that are still in the queue.
I'm happy to answer, and I do appreciate everybody hanging in for the full hour. And if you'd like to continue to listen to the Q&A, please do so.
And before I ask a new question, we did have one of our customers chime in as you were giving the radiology answer, and maybe you could respond to this. And the comment, more than question, was that radiology is more than PACS. You could use FHIR to get pathology results for follow-up recommendations, close the loop, etc. I don't know if that warrants a response or a follow-up comment, Dave, or not.
I'll say cheers and hear, right? That I agree that it's definitely. So I wasn't saying. Well, I took the question as how is it that PACS and DICOM are impacted by FHIR, and I think we agree that there's a lot more to the story in radiology than just PACS. So I think as I like to say, we're in violent agreement.
And here's a question. How will FHIR and OpenEHR exchange data? Will it be possible to convert archetypes to features and vice versa?
Oof, an excellent question. I'm not the expert on the OpenAir stuff or on the mapping process that's ongoing, but I know that there is a reconciliation process between OpenAir and the FHIR data types in particular. I would go Google that, but my ultimate answer is that it sure would be great if we could get to a single set of format and a data model that works for as many people as possible. I think it's fair to say that HL7 was more, HL7 V3 data types was more influential on the data types we have in FHIR than the OpenAir data model. But I'm really hopeful that there is a consolidation over time. So I see this as the parallel we had historically was that ASTM went off and created the format, which was the continuity of care record, right, the CCR, and it was an XML format that was proprietary or made up, descriptive, but certainly didn't have the clinical rigor behind it that the HL7 CDA did. And there was a reconciliation that went on to say, look, there's this content we want to move, which is the continuity of care record. We're doing it in a proprietary way. Can we smush this into a CDA? And that's how we ended up with the continuity of care record data getting encoded in a CDA, and that's the thing we call the continuity of care document. So I'm hopeful there's a similar approach we can take with the open air guys and FHIR to bring it together.
And I think I have one more question for you, Dave. A number of the questions fit into this box, and so I think this is a good ending question, and that is this. How soon will major EMRs have FHIR APIs available? Will EHRs offer their open APIs for free?
Gosh, that's the $10 billion question. I think it's absolutely accurate to say that every major EMR vendor, especially obviously those participating in Argonaut, are already claiming to have a FHIR API on their product. So available on product and in production and available in your machine room, I think are two different things of, what does one have to do to get on the, if I'm on Epic version 2013 and Epic version 2016 is the one with FHIR, that alone is a 6-month project for me and my entire IT organization and clinical staff. It's a $5 million project for me to go from one version of Epic to the next. That problem has to be solved, right? Or I'm running version X of a vendor's application and I need to install a module that turns FHIR on. It isn't clear whether those vendors are going to give those red boxes, right, those modules away for free. It's also not clear if they're going to give full, CRUD, as we say, create, read, update, and delete access. I think a lot of them, at least in the context of Argonaut, are doing read-only. So you can query and interact in a very small way with your FHIR API, but you can't do everything. So this is, again, it's playing out over time. I hate to use the analogy because it didn't turn out well, but when is the United States going to adopt the metric system that I heard about so much as a kid? And with the exception of a few things like liters of Diet Coke, we don't have a lot of adoption yet, even today, some number of years later. And I think FHIR has got some of the same attributes, that it's going to solve problems first and foremost that aren't solvable today. So that's why I think Smart on FHIR is cool, and I think that it does solve a problem that is not otherwise solved. And I think the workflow process is going to drive a lot of this, that as vendors use FHIR internally, they'll expose those capabilities to their customer base. So it's hopefully not like waiting for Godot, where it may or may not ever show up, but I think that a lot of vendors have said a lot of very positive things about FHIR. There's a bunch of vendors that are attending. We've done, I think it's 17 or 18 interoperability tests at the HL7 organization. I see all these vendors participating, and I see the depth of functionality they have. And at least in the lab, this stuff is all coming together pretty quickly in comparison to how long it's taken the industry to adopt HL7 V2. So the wild card in the answer is meaningful use stage 3, and the requirement that theoretically the requirement that we are going to require a standards-based open API in order to be MU3 certified. And whether meaningful use continues to play an interesting part of product planning and reimbursement strategy will be figured out. That's my short-winded, long-winded answer.
There you go. That was a good ending question. So with that, I'll say to anyone still on the line, we will take a good hard look at any of the submitted questions, and if we don't feel any of these answers hit those, we'll make sure to reply to you via email so that you get your question answered. And with that, I would like to thank all of you for spending time with us, especially the overtime. And especially I'd like to thank Dave for putting together a great conversation, and for everyone's interaction. It was a very good interactive session. And I'd like to thank everyone for their time, and hope you have a wonderful rest of the week.